August 15, 1940, 22,000 feet above Kent, southeast England. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler held his Messerschmitt Bf 109E in a lazy climb, scanning the sky through his canopy for the British fighters they'd been warned about. Below, his squadron, 12 aircraft in loose formation, crossed the English Channel at 320 kilometers per hour. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, light winds, flying weather. 6 weeks into the air campaign against Britain, Stigler had flown 27 sorties. He'd seen British fighters before, mostly Hurricanes, occasionally the Spitfires that RAF pilots seemed to favour. Neither concerned him particularly. The 109 was faster, could climb higher, had better acceleration. German pilots joked that fighting the British was like a racing car against a lorry. You simply used your speed and altitude advantage until the enemy made a mistake, then killed them. The Luftwaffe had been promised this would be quick. Reichsmarshal Goering had told them Britain's air force was already broken, that one final push would clear the skies for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion that would finish what Dunkirk had started. Intelligence briefings showed the numbers. The RAF had lost nearly 500 fighters in France and over the Channel. They couldn't replace aircraft fast enough. Their pilot training was rushed, their tactics defensive, their morale cracking. Germany had 2,800 aircraft available for operations against Britain. The RAF had perhaps 700 fighters. The mathematics were simple. Then Stigler's wingman's voice cracked over the radio. "Achtung, fighters, 2 o'clock high." Stigler looked up and saw them. 8 aircraft in 2 formations diving from 25,000 feet, coming nearly vertical out of the sun. Spitfires. He recognized the elliptical wings even at distance. He wasn't worried. The 109 could outdive anything in the sky. He pushed his stick forward, rolled into a defensive turn, and prepared to use his superior speed to disengage, climb, and re-engage from advantage. The Spitfire followed him through the turn without losing ground. Stigler pulled harder, tightening his circle, pulling 4 Gs, then 5. The Spitfire stayed with him, turning inside his radius, closing the distance. Stigler's peripheral vision caught tracer rounds arcing past his canopy. The British pilot was already in firing position. Stigler broke hard left, dove, then pulled into a climbing spiral, a maneuver that used the 109's power-to-weight advantage. The Spitfire followed through the entire sequence, matching him turn for turn. This wasn't supposed to happen. Stigler's engine screamed as he pushed it to combat power, trying to extend distance using straight-line speed. He gained perhaps 50 meters before the Spitfire closed again. The British pilot was methodical, patient, staying just outside effective gun range, but refusing to let Stigler disengage. The fight lasted 4 minutes. To Stigler it felt like an hour. He used every advantage the 109 possessed: speed, climb rate, dive performance, and the Spitfire countered each one. When Stigler finally broke away in a near-vertical dive toward France, pulling out at treetop level over the Channel, he was sweating despite the cockpit's cold, his hands shaking slightly on the stick. He looked back once. The Spitfire had broken off, climbing back to altitude to rejoin its squadron. It hadn't chased him to the French coast, didn't need to. It had made its point. When Stigler landed at his base near Calais, he sat in his cockpit for several minutes before climbing out, trying to process what had just happened. The Spitfire wasn't supposed to be that good. The myth. Before the war, German intelligence had assessed the Spitfire with the same methodical precision they applied to every British weapon system. The reports were thorough, detailed, and fundamentally wrong. Designed by R.J. Mitchell, the Spitfire first flew in March 1936. It was elegant, unusually so for a military aircraft. The elliptical wing design was aerodynamically efficient, but expensive to manufacture. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was powerful, but complex and prone to maintenance issues in field conditions. The armament, 8.303 caliber machine guns, was light compared to German cannon. German pilots who'd seen early Spitfires during the Spanish Civil War described them as pretty but unimpressive, too light, too maneuverable for its own good. Maneuverability meant drag meant lower speed and climb rate. The British had built an aerobatic display aircraft, not a fighter. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, by contrast, was purpose-built for killing. It was angular, aggressive, powered by the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine that gave it a top speed of 570 kilometers per hour. It carried two 20mm cannons and two machine guns, enough firepower to destroy any aircraft with a single burst. Its rate of climb was phenomenal. In a dive, it could outrun anything the RAF possessed. More importantly, the 109 pilots who flew it were veterans. Many had combat experience in Spain. They'd trained together, developed tactics together, fought together. They understood energy management, altitude advantage, boom and zoom attacks. They were professionals. The British, by German assessment, were amateurs. RAF Fighter Command had expanded rapidly after 1938, recruiting pilots faster than they could properly train them. Many had less than 200 flying hours. Their tactics were rigid, based on pre-war formations designed for interception of unescorted bombers. They flew tight formations that looked impressive on parade, but couldn't maneuver in combat. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated the RAF would collapse within 3 weeks of sustained operations. Their pilots would be killed faster than they could be replaced. Their aircraft production couldn't match German output. Their morale would break once it became clear that Germany controlled the skies. Major Werner Mulders, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, put it simply in a letter home. The British have brave pilots and beautiful aircraft, but they're fighting yesterday's war. We'll sweep them aside. The German High Command believed him. Goering believed him. Every pilot in the Jagdwaffe believed him. The Spitfire was elegant, yes, but elegance didn't win wars. On July 10, 1940, when the Luftwaffe began its systematic air campaign to destroy the RAF and clear the way for invasion, German pilots expected 3 weeks of difficult but manageable combat. They got 4 months of the most brutal aerial warfare in history, and at the end of it, the RAF was stronger than when it started. The reality: design. What German intelligence missed, what almost everyone missed until combat revealed it, was that the Spitfire wasn't designed to specifications. It was designed by an engineer who understood instinctively what combat would actually require. R.J. Mitchell had terminal cancer when he designed the Spitfire. He died in 1937, a year after the first prototype flew, at age 42. He never saw his aircraft in combat. But he'd spent years studying racing aircraft, understanding how to extract maximum performance from minimum weight, and he'd incorporated that knowledge into a fighter that defied conventional wisdom. The elliptical wing wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it provided the most efficient lift distribution possible, which meant the Spitfire could turn tighter than any other fighter at combat speeds without stalling. The thin wing section reduced drag dramatically. The flush riveting and careful attention to airflow meant that even with the same engine as the Hurricane, the Spitfire was 50 kilometers per hour faster. More critically, Mitchell had designed the aircraft to be upgraded. The wing structure could handle larger engines. The airframe could accommodate heavier armament. The basic design had enough margin that it could evolve as the war demanded. Between 1938 and 1945, the Spitfire went through 24 major variants and countless minor modifications. Engine power increased from 1,030 horsepower to 2,050. Top speed increased from 580 kilometers per hour to 730 kilometers per hour. Armament changed from 8 machine guns to 4 20mm cannons. Operating ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 43,000 feet. The Bf 109 also evolved, but its basic airframe was at its limits by 1941. The Spitfire kept getting better, but specifications didn't matter in July 1940. What mattered was what happened when British and German pilots met over southern England in aircraft that were, on paper, roughly equal. The difference was doctrine. The doctrine. The Luftwaffe trained its pilots to fight as individuals. The basic tactical unit was the Schwarm, 4 aircraft in 2 pairs. The lead pilot was the killer. His wingman protected him. The pairs supported each other, but each pilot was expected to maintain situational awareness, make independent decisions, exploit opportunities as they appeared. German pilots called it freie Jagd, free hunting. Find the enemy, use your speed and altitude to dictate engagement terms, attack from advantage, break away before the enemy could respond. Never turn with the enemy. Speed and altitude were everything. The RAF, in contrast, had trained its pilots to fight in rigid formations of 3 aircraft, called Vics, which looked impressive but couldn't maneuver without breaking formation. The lead aircraft attacked, the wingmen followed. Individual initiative was discouraged. German pilots saw these formations in early combats and knew they were facing amateurs. What they didn't know was that RAF Fighter Command was learning. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, wasn't interested in tradition or regulations. He was interested in results. When his squadron commanders reported that the pre-war tactics were getting pilots killed, he told them to develop new ones. When pilots requested changes to armament, cockpit layout, or radio equipment, he authorized them immediately if they made sense. The RAF adapted faster than the Luftwaffe expected because it had something the Germans lacked: institutional flexibility and a command structure that trusted its pilots to innovate. By August 1940, RAF squadrons had abandoned the rigid Vic formations. They flew in pairs, leader and wingman, with spacing that allowed maneuver. They adopted the German Schwarm tactics, but modified them for the Spitfire's superior turning ability. Instead of boom and zoom attacks, they learned to bait German fighters into turning engagements where the Spitfire's advantages became decisive. More critically, Dowding had built an integrated air defense system unlike anything the Germans possessed. The chain-home radar network detected incoming raids 100 miles out. Observer Corps spotters tracked them inland. Fighter Command operations rooms collated information in real time and vectored squadrons to intercept with altitude and position advantage. German bombers never knew if they'd face fighters or find empty sky, and German escort fighters never knew if they'd outnumber their opponents or be outnumbered. The Luftwaffe was flying blind. Fighter Command was fighting with perfect knowledge of enemy dispositions. By mid-August, when the Luftwaffe committed fully to destroying Fighter Command, German pilots were discovering that everything they'd believed about British capabilities was wrong. The RAF wasn't collapsing, it was getting stronger. August 15th, the hardest day. August 15th, 1940, became known as the hardest day in RAF history, not because of losses, but because of operational intensity. The Luftwaffe launched 2,119 sorties, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft. The goal was to overwhelm Fighter Command through sheer numbers, hit multiple targets simultaneously, force British fighters to engage everywhere at once, attrit them until they couldn't respond. Fighter Command flew 974 sorties in response. The day began at 7:30 with raids against Newcastle and Sunderland in northeast England, targets the Luftwaffe believed were outside RAF fighter range. They sent 65 bombers escorted by 34 Bf 110 heavy fighters. The Bf 109 lacked range for northern operations. They were intercepted by Spitfires from 72 Squadron. The Bf 110 pilots discovered immediately that their aircraft designed as a long-range escort fighter, couldn't compete with Spitfires in air-to-air combat. The 110 was heavy, sluggish in turns, vulnerable when attacked from the beam. The Spitfires tore through the formation, shooting down 8 bombers and 7 fighters in 15 minutes. The surviving Germans jettisoned their bombs into the North Sea and ran for home. At 11:30, massive raids hit airfields across southeast England, Hawking, Lympne, Martlesham Heath. The Germans committed 300 aircraft to these attacks, the largest daylight formation yet seen over Britain. Fighter Command responded with 22 squadrons, approximately 250 Spitfires and Hurricanes. The air battles spread across 100 miles of sky. German formations broke apart under repeated attacks. Individual combats dissolved into swirling dogfights where altitude and speed advantages became irrelevant. The Spitfires proved they could turn inside anything the Luftwaffe flew. Lieutenant Julius Neumann, flying a Bf 109 with JG-27, encountered 6 Spitfires over Dover at 1:50 p.m. His post-combat report described the engagement. "We had altitude, 23,000 feet to their 20,000. We had position, attacking from the sun. We had numerical advantage, 12 of us to their 6. We used proper tactics, diving attack, 1 burst each, break away and climb. We shot down 1 Spitfire in the initial pass. The remaining 5 didn't run. They turned into us. For 8 minutes we attempted to disengage and re-engage from advantage. The Spitfires refused to allow it. They stayed with us through dives, climbs and high-speed turns. Their pilots flew as if the aircraft had no limits. Eventually 3 of us made it back to France. The Spitfires broke off once we crossed the coast. They didn't need to pursue. They defended their airspace. We'd failed our mission. I've flown 47 combat sorties. I've never seen pilots or aircraft perform at that level. These aren't the amateurs we were told to expect." By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 aircraft destroyed, 40 damaged beyond repair. Fighter Command lost 34 aircraft destroyed, 18 damaged, but 24 pilots survived to fly again. More critically, not one RAF airfield was put out of action. The radar stations continued operating. The operations rooms functioned normally. The Luftwaffe had committed everything available and failed to achieve any strategic objective. That night, German intelligence officers tried to reconcile the day's losses with their pre-war assessments. The numbers didn't make sense. RAF Fighter Command was supposed to have 500 operational fighters at most, yet they'd flown nearly 1,000 sorties. British pilots were supposed to be poorly trained, yet they'd fought with skill and aggression that matched or exceeded German standards. Someone had been very wrong about British capabilities. The attrition. The Luftwaffe's plan for Britain relied on mathematical certainty. Germany could replace losses faster than Britain. Therefore, sustained combat would inevitably favour Germany. The mathematics were sound, the assumptions were wrong. German aircraft production in 1940, 10,826 aircraft of all types, including approximately 1,900 single-engine fighters. British aircraft production in 1940, 15,049 aircraft, including 4,283 fighters. Germany was building fewer aircraft than Britain, despite having a larger industrial base and more resources. The reason was strategic priority. Hitler's focus was on bombers for offensive operations and ground attack aircraft for supporting the army. Fighter production was secondary. Britain, under Lord Beaverbrook's ruthless management of aircraft production, had made fighters the absolute priority. Everything else, bombers, trainers, transports, was secondary to getting Spitfires and Hurricanes to squadrons. More critically, Britain's repair system was faster. Damaged aircraft were recovered, assessed, and either repaired at forward maintenance units or cannibalized for parts. Aircraft that German pilots reported as destroyed were often flying again within days. But production numbers didn't win battles. Pilots did. And this was where the Luftwaffe's calculations completely failed. German pilot training took 18 to 24 months and emphasized individual skill, aerobatics and gunnery. It produced excellent pilots when it produced them, but the system couldn't scale quickly. British pilot training took 6 to 9 months and emphasized basic competency, squadron tactics and survival. It produced adequate pilots in large numbers, and those pilots learned through combat what training couldn't teach. More importantly, wounded British pilots could be back in combat within weeks. Wounded German pilots faced a long recovery in Germany, then return flights that exposed them to RAF fighters. British pilots who bailed out over Britain could be back in combat the same day. German pilots who bailed out over Britain went to POW camps. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. The RAF was gaining experienced pilots every day. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, the pilot who'd encountered his first Spitfire on August 15th, flew 41 more combat sorties before being shot down over Dover on September the 27th. He bailed out, was captured, and spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp. In his initial interrogation, the British intelligence officer asked him what had changed his opinion of the RAF. Stiegler thought carefully before answering. "We believed we were fighting an inferior force that would break under pressure. Instead, we found professionals who got better every day we fought them. Their aircraft weren't inferior. They were different, optimized for defensive operations in ways we didn't understand. The Spitfire couldn't outrun the 109, but in the kind of fighting that happened over Britain, turning, climbing, sustained combat, it was superior. But the aircraft wasn't the real problem. The problem was we were fighting over their territory, on their terms, against their integrated defense system, with pilots who could bail out and fly again the next day while ours went to prison camps. The mathematics of that equation only work one way. We could have had better aircraft and better pilots. It wouldn't have mattered. The strategic situation was impossible." September 15th, the breaking point. By early September, the Luftwaffe had shifted strategy. Goering ordered attacks on London itself, partly in retaliation for RAF raids on Berlin, partly hoping to draw out fighter command for a decisive battle. September 15th was the culmination of this strategy. 2 massive raids on London involving over 1,000 German aircraft. Fighter command committed everything available, 31 squadrons, approximately 300 fighters. The first raid came at 11:30 hours, 200-plus German aircraft crossing the coast in tight formations. They were intercepted by 11 group squadrons over Kent and Sussex, Spitfires taking the high-altitude fighters, Hurricanes hitting the bombers. The German formations broke apart under repeated attacks. Individual flights scattered. Some bombers reached London and dropped their loads. Most jettisoned bombs randomly and turned for home. The second raid came at 1400 hours. Another 150-plus aircraft approaching from different directions, hoping to split British defences. They were met by squadrons that had landed, rearmed, refueled and returned to combat in 45 minutes, something German planners had thought impossible. Park officer John Kent, flying a Spitfire with 303 Polish Squadron, described the afternoon engagement. "We intercepted at 18,000 feet over Maidstone. The German formation was massive, 30 bombers with 60 fighters above and around them. We had 12 aircraft. We didn't hesitate. We went straight in. The key to fighting formations that size isn't trying to destroy everything. It's breaking their cohesion, make them nervous, force the fighters to stay defensive, get the bombers to jettison. We dove through the fighter screen, fired into the bomber formation from point-blank range, maybe 200 yards, then broke in different directions. The German fighters couldn't track us all. The bombers panicked. Formation discipline collapsed. By the time we disengaged, the Germans were scattered across 20 miles of sky, individual aircraft running for the coast at top speed. That's what the Spitfire allowed us to do. Get in close, cause chaos, get out alive. The 109 was faster, but in that kind of close-quarters combat, our turning ability made us untouchable. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft. Fighter Command lost 29, but more than numbers, September 15th proved that the Luftwaffe couldn't protect its bombers, couldn't defeat Fighter Command, and couldn't establish air superiority over Britain. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion was off. The Luftwaffe had failed. October, the transition. The large daylight raids stopped after September. The Luftwaffe switched to night bombing, the Blitz, where British fighters had limited effectiveness. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Germany couldn't invade Britain. The RAF controlled British airspace. The Spitfire, the elegant, supposedly inferior fighter that German pilots had dismissed, had proven itself the equal or superior of anything the Luftwaffe could field. By October, captured German pilots consistently described the Spitfire with respect bordering on awe. Intelligence reports documented a shift in Luftwaffe fighter tactics. Avoid turning engagements with Spitfires. Use speed to engage and disengage. Never assume superiority. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, was asked by Göring what he needed to win the battle. Galland's response became famous. A squadron of Spitfires. Göring was furious. He thought Galland was being sarcastic. He wasn't. He was being honest. The Spitfire had advantages the Bf 109 couldn't match in the type of warfare being fought over Britain. Tighter turning radius, better visibility from the cockpit, longer combat endurance, and, perhaps most critically, the ability to operate from grass airfields close to the battle area, while the 109 required prepared runways in France. More fundamentally, the Spitfire was part of a system: radar, ground control, maintenance, pilot training, industrial production. The Germans had built excellent individual components. The British had built an integrated air defense network. Systems beat components. The Reckoning. Between July 10th and October 31st, 1940, the period officially designated as the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe flew 54,000-plus sorties and lost 1,887 aircraft. Fighter Command flew 28,000-plus sorties and lost 1,023 aircraft. But numbers don't capture what actually happened. The Luftwaffe entered the battle expecting quick victory against an inferior opponent. They left having failed to achieve any strategic objective despite numerical superiority and better initial pilot training. Fighter Command entered the battle with undertrained pilots, inadequate tactics, and aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as inferior. They won by adapting faster, learning from mistakes, and exploiting advantages in doctrine and system integration that the Germans never understood. The Spitfire wasn't superior to the Bf 109 in all respects. It was superior in the respects that mattered for defensive operations over Britain: turn rate, combat persistence, and the ability to operate from dispersed bases. German pilots learned this through bitter experience. In early combats, they treated Spitfires as target practice. By September, they avoided Spitfires when possible and fought them with extreme caution when unavoidable. The psychological shift was profound. The Luftwaffe had spent years building an aura of invincibility. Spain, Poland, Norway, France, everywhere they'd fought, they dominated. Britain was supposed to be the final confirmation of German air superiority. Instead, the RAF broke them, not through superior numbers or better aircraft or more skilled pilots, though by war's end they had all three, but through superior system design, faster adaptation, and the simple willingness to keep fighting when the mathematics said they should have surrendered. The survivors. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham flew Spitfires with 92 Squadron throughout the Battle of Britain. He was 18 years old when it began, one of the youngest RAF fighter pilots. He survived the war, lived to age 96, and spent decades trying to explain to people what it had been like. In his memoir, written 60 years later, he described his feelings the first time he fought a Bf 109. "I was terrified. Everything I'd been taught suggested the 109 was superior. Faster, better climbing, heavier armed. I expected to die. Then we engaged and I realized something. My aircraft could turn inside his. Every time he tried to get guns on me, I could turn and spoil his shot. Every time I tried to get guns on him, he had to run or risk being outturned. That doesn't mean I wasn't scared. Combat at 25,000 feet at 300 miles per hour is terrifying regardless of what you're flying. But I wasn't helpless. I had an aircraft that responded to what I asked of it, that didn't have vices or quirks, that let me fight on equal or better terms. The Spitfire didn't make me brave, but it made survival possible, and survival made me experienced, and experience made me effective. By September, I'd flown 48 combat sorties. I'd been shot at hundreds of times. I'd shot down 3 confirmed, probably destroyed 2 more. I'd lost friends. I'd seen aircraft explode at close range. I'd bailed out once over Kent and was back in combat 6 hours later. I wasn't the same person who'd started in July. None of us were. But we'd survived. And because we survived, Britain survived. That's what the Spitfire gave us, a fighting chance. That's all you can ask of an aircraft, a fighting chance against a determined enemy who wants you dead. We took that chance and made it into a victory. The legacy. The Spitfire fought from September 1939 to August 1945, longer than any other Allied fighter. It served in every theatre: Britain, Mediterranean, North Africa, Burma, Pacific. It was never obsolete. Each time German aircraft improved, the Spitfire improved to match. Each time new requirements emerged, the design accommodated them. The Bf 109 also evolved and remained formidable throughout the war, but it never again had the aura of invincibility it possessed in July 1940. More than 20,000 Spitfires were built, more than 33,000 Bf 109s. But numbers don't tell the story. The story is in what happened over southern England in the summer of 1940, when German pilots who'd conquered Europe in weeks found themselves unable to conquer an island in months. The story is in the systematic destruction of Luftwaffe assumptions about British capabilities. The story is in the realization, by both sides, that aircraft design matters less than how aircraft are employed, that tactical flexibility beats rigid doctrine, that integrated systems beat superior components. Most fundamentally, the story is in the transformation of perception. German pilots who'd laughed at the elegant British fighter in July were avoiding it in September and requesting it in October. The Spitfire didn't win the war, but it won the battle that made winning the war possible, and in doing so, it destroyed the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, not through propaganda or boasting, but through the simple, methodical work of defending British airspace against an enemy that expected quick victory and found endless resistance. The empty sky. November 1940. The daylight battles had ended. German bombers came at night now, where Spitfires couldn't easily intercept them. But something had changed over Britain's skies. The Luftwaffe no longer operated with confidence. Their formations were cautious, their tactics defensive, their pilots respectful of an enemy they dismissed 6 months earlier. At RAF Biggin Hill, Spitfires sat on grass dispersals, pilots at readiness, waiting for raids that came less frequently each week. The Germans had tried to destroy fighter command and failed. They'd tried to establish air superiority and failed. They'd tried to clear the way for invasion and failed. The Spitfire, the aircraft German intelligence had called pretty but unimpressive, had become the symbol of British resistance. Its elliptical wings were painted on walls, printed in newspapers, moulded into jewellery. But for the pilots who flew them, the Spitfire was just a tool, well designed, beautifully handling, effective in combat, but ultimately just an aircraft that did what it was supposed to do. It kept them alive long enough to win, and in the end, that was enough. The sky over Britain remained British. The pilots who defended it, some dead, some wounded, some still flying, had done their duty professionally and without fuss, because that's what RAF pilots did. The Germans had boasted their Luftwaffe was invincible. The British had simply proven otherwise. One combat at a time, one day at a time, until the enemy stopped coming. The Spitfire's wings cut through empty sky, elegant and deadly, waiting for the next threat. It wouldn't have to wait long. The war had 4.5 years left to run. But the Battle of Britain was over, and Britain had won.